And joining me now from New York City, Peter Ginsberg. Thank you very much for joining me. I appreciate it.
It's good to be here, Travis. Thank you.
Well, this is an interesting time in professional golf for us, and as we go down this path of a true competitor at the table in the world of professional golf, and there's so much on the table here that I want to ask you, and so many angles that we could come at this from. But let's start here, Peter. You've had a lot of success on behalf of your clients against some of the biggest sports organizations, including NCAA, the NFL, and the PGA Tour. The competitor here is the LIV investment group, LIV Golf. It's accusing the PGA Tour of archaic and monopolistic practices. Based on your experience, what's your view right now of PGA Tour regulations?
Well, having fought at least some of the PGA Tour regulations, I'm clearly not a fan, and I think that the PGA, in a lot of ways, is archaic and does a fairly effective job at being as monopolistic as possible, and to keep dissenting voices out, and to have control from the top down in a way that compromises its players' activities and rights. Having said that, I don't think that necessarily dictates how its dispute with the Saudis is going to come out, or its dispute with Greg Norman is going to resolve. I think it's a very complicated situation.
Mm-hmm. So there's a lot of discussion in the public amongst the fans of the tour restricting members who are independent contractors. So the players are independent contractors. The PGA Tour, of course, is a non-for-profit organization. Where is the line in what the tour can and cannot enforce given those terms?
Oh, it's interesting. I think one of the things the tour ultimately is going to be most concerned about is whether it's going to be able to keep its not-for-profit status. It's almost a joke to say the tour, just like the NFL, is a not-for-profit organization, although technically that's obviously correct. The tour stands in an unusual position for two reasons. One is in contrast to the NFL, for instance. The participants are independent contractors and not employees, and that has legal consequences. The second unusual aspect of the tour is that, again, in contrast to the NFL or the NHL or Major League Baseball, there's no union, no collective bargaining agreement, and under the law, that means it does not have effectively the right to monopolize in the same way as a unionized sport does. So the PGA, for those two reasons, is in a potentially more vulnerable position than the NFL might be, to preclude its players from playing for an offshoot league at the same time as they're playing for the NFL.
So they can enforce, right? Like, clearly the tour, Jay Monahan, the commissioner, there's rules and regulations. They can enforce when a player acts out, whether it's financial, whether it's some kind of other disciplinary action. But they've drawn a pretty thick line here, right? I mean, Jay Monahan has basically stated, look, you're either with us or you're without us, right? If you go to the LIV group and you're going to play on that tour, then you're probably not going to play on the PGA Tour. Is that too thick of a line to draw in the sand?
Well, I think that there are certain factors that provide Monahan with some rational basis for doing what he's doing. On the one hand, the law looks at, for instance, whether consumers would be benefited or not with additional competition.
Mm-hmm.
On the other hand, what Monahan can say with some appropriateness is that if he didn't enforce the rules that all the players agreed to, there would be havoc in the scheduling, there would be havoc in the rankings, there are certain inefficiencies would be built into the system. Now, I'm not sure that the golf fan can decide whether he or she wants to watch a particular competition. I think if I were Monahan, one of the things I would recommend to him, and this is somewhat contrary to its sort of archaic and very conservative philosophy and view of the world, I think Monahan might have a much stronger case if he said, look, Saudi Arabia right now, because of its politics and because of its history, because of its reputation, wouldn't necessarily tarnish the participants. That we as an organization, have a right to take a stand adverse to Saudi Arabia. We want to make a political statement. The NBA, not necessarily voluntarily, but the NBA essentially took that same position with China a couple of years ago. And I think that if Monahan were to mix the politics with his commercial desires, he effectively might have a much stronger case. And when you look at the other side of this dispute, there is Saudi Arabia with its horrific history of killing journalists, suppressing minorities, having antiquated, although somewhat liberating now, policies towards women and minorities. Greg Norman and Phil Mickelson are not really the ideal spokesperson for, in my opinion anyhow, for what they are trying to accomplish. I mean, it's almost laughable to hear Greg Norman say that he cares about the rights of the players. What he cares about is the extraordinary amount of money he's making. And his comments sort of brushing to the side the history of Saudi Arabia, I think, speaks volumes as to what he really cares about.
Mm-hmm.
So I think there are different ways that Monahan could play this. I don't think he'll do it. I don't think that the PGA is sort of liberated enough to take a political stand like that. But I think ultimately it could help him in with public opinion and potentially even legally.
So if I'm hearing you right here, one of the things that might hurt the PGA Tour's stance is you're putting it, archaic stance and regulations of things. That might be something, if this does go to court, which for all intents and purposes, it sure looks like we're going that way, that they could be on the wrong side of that. If you look at where their stance and their regulation, I mean, would that be an example of where they are on the wrong side? Is there others that you could see that are kind of glaring that could be an issue to the PGA Tour? And then on the flip side, where are they on the right side of things as we go down this path to potential lawsuits?
When you look at antitrust law, the sort of two driving forces are monopoly and conspiracy. There's no doubt that the PGA has, well, let me modify that. The PGA does have a monopoly over professional golf. There are some competing tours, or at least tours that theoretically are competitors in Europe and elsewhere. But for the most part, I don't think it could be legitimately argued that the PGA does not have monopolistic powers. And the PGA historically has exercised those powers by compromising players' rights, by doing what it can to modify players' rights with regard to speech, with regard to activities. I mean, a couple years ago, the PGA got involved in a dispute about a deer antler spray, and allowed the senior players to use the stuff, but not the PGA players, and essentially lied about its policies. Monahan wasn't the commissioner then; Fincham was, but Fincham went after especially Vijay Singh in a very public way, and seemed to feel by his actions and by his words that he could essentially be a dictator with regard to all things, including it's his disciplinary rights. And the PGA, at some point, I think will have to come, will have its reckoning about that. And there's been some progress in other sports for compromising, or at least modifying, the ways that the leagues exercise their monopolistic powers. And it may well happen to the PGA, and may well happen to the PGA here.
Mm-hmm. If there are lawsuits, which is, again, I think where we're going here, and players are suspended by the PGA Tour or the DP World Tour, how does injunctive relief work to allow players to keep competing while the case is ongoing? How does that work?
The players would have to prove in court that they had two things: that they had a likelihood of success on the merits and would be irreparably injured if they were precluded from playing on the PGA Tour. And on the flip side, the PGA, sort of to rebut the burden that would be on the players if it were the players who were seeking injunctive relief against the PGA would have to prove that it had a rational basis for doing what it was doing and suspending the players. And therefore, the PGA would attempt to rebut the likelihood of success, showing that the players would have the burden of proving.
Mm-hmm.
It would really, there's, especially in the world of antitrust, there's no way you can sit here today and say one side is right and one side is wrong. You can have, a political, a moral, and ethical reckoning about which side you think is right and wrong. Antitrust is a very, very complicated area of law.
Mm.
I don't think that there will be it's not going to be clear, but it's going to be very interesting.
Yeah. Well, and what makes it further interesting, Peter, in some of your previous encounters with the sport, there's other governing bodies, like the 4 major championships in professional golf are not operated by the PGA Tour, which we've been talking about to this point. And you've got the Masters, right, which is Augusta National. You've got the U.S. Open, which is coming up in 2 weeks, which is the USGA. You've got the PGA Championship, which is the PGA. And of course, the PGA is different than the PGA Tour. We're talking about the PGA Tour here. And then you got the Open Championship, which is the RNA. So there's all these other governing bodies that are going to have to weigh in as well at some point and can govern in their own ways. And like, that's just a whole other discussion, isn't it? In what these 4 governing bodies are going to be able to do, because I'm sure the PGA Tour is looking at these guys saying, look, guys, are you with us here as we go down this path or not?
Travis, that's really an excellent point. And it can work both ways. On the one hand, the PGA Tour can take the position in combating the claim of monopoly. Hey, look, we do have other other organizations involved who are independent and have a significant say in the world of golf. We're not a monopoly the way the NFL, for instance, is a monopoly in pro football. On the other hand, if those four entities follow suit and there's any evidence of the five entities conspiring together, it will help the Saudi position with regard to proving a conspiracy. But that's right. I mean, the PGA can say there are these four organizations, there are tours in Europe, there are other tours. We're not a monopoly. We just happen to be the best. And the players, by signing their membership agreement as independent contractors, acknowledge we're the best. And the reason we are the best is that we do keep an orderly control over golf, and we do keep schedules, and the fan base gets to anticipate that the top players are going to be at every significant tournament.
Mm-hmm.
So that's another reason why it's complicated. And look, there are precedents that go both ways. I think it was in 1974, the Federal Trade Commission actually internally, or some of its staff attorneys, in a very similar situation, determined that the PGA was a monopoly and couldn't do almost essentially what it's trying to do now. The FTC never took any action, which could speak to any number of things. It could speak to a decision that the staff attorneys were wrong. It could speak to the fact that PGA is so strong that the FTC didn't want to fight it. I mean, it's hard to know. Mm-hmm. In the tennis world, I think Billie Jean King tried to start a competitive tennis circuit and had an adverse determination that the tennis organizations could control a schedule and could do essentially what Monahan wants to do with the PGA. So there is some precedent, but it's hard to tell. Those are not recent cases. Antitrust law, not the law itself, but antitrust enforcement changes from administration to administration. Mm-hmm. And look, it may be that the Department of Justice is more concerned about things that probably should be more concerned about in terms of whether big business is monopolizing and driving up consumer prices and things of that sort. It may be that the Department of Justice doesn't want to waste its resources, but that doesn't stop the parties from having private litigation over this issue.
Mm-hmm. When you look at the LIV group and how they've strategized and have executed and positioned itself to this point, right? Because clearly there's a strategy for them here as they've Greg Norman leading the charge and then Phil Mickelson coming over. And now they set their schedule, and their first event is in London next week. And they've now drawn a couple names, the biggest being Dustin Johnson, which is a big star on the PGA Tour. And he's now going over there. And, of course, going against what Monahan ruled as far as denying these guys release. And usually a release overseas, you'll get those one-offs. These players will be able to go do that. In the United States, those releases are not granted unless if it's a made-for-TV type of special event like we just saw that was called The Match.
Right.
The next event for the LIV series in July will be in Portland, Oregon. And so you have all these guys applying for the release. Monahan, I thought, would allow them to go to London, but then draw the line when they come to the United States, because his position would be probably a little more padded versus with the direct competition of the tour in the United States. Were you surprised that he drew the line that quickly with this first event being in London and not in the United States?
I think given my somewhat idiosyncratic experiences with Monahan and the PGA. I'm never surprised at anything they do.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm not surprised at the PGA looking at all issues as black and white issues and saying, taking the position that, hey, we're right, they're wrong, and the line is not, can't be blurred. So no, I think institutionally it's consistent with the way the PGA generally functions.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not sure they're getting the best legal advice, having drawn the line the way they did.
Mm.
I think the PGA probably would be in a stronger position if it took if it did as you suggested. And especially because there isn't any kind of political outcry. It's just a business decision. I do question whether the PGA Tour is following the right script as far as legal strategy is concerned.
What's your analysis on the other side in the way that the LIV group is going about this and their strategy and their positioning? Because if I'm hearing you right, what they want to see is, and what they have to be able to prove is this monopoly, right? I mean, that's really what it's coming down to for them. Am I hearing you correctly?
Monopoly or a conspiracy, correct?
Mm-hmm.
Look, I think they are probably doing it right. They're forcing Monahan to make these kind of black and white decisions that speak louder to the claim of monopoly. So I think not predicting at the end of the day that it will prevail, but I think the LIV is probably doing it the way that buttresses its legal position as best it can.
So an antitrust lawsuit, that's very complicated, but at the end of the day, it's a monopoly or conspiracy, right? I mean, that's what we're up against here.
And one of the factors that the courts will look at is how it affects the consumer. And look, you clearly know lots more about golf than I do, but I would think in a situation like this, there are probably arguments on both sides, whether consumers are better off having a competitive tour like the LIV because there's more excitement, more you can articulate for me better than I can how the consumers would be benefited. On the other hand, there are arguments to be made that the consumer would have less assurances about who he or she was going to follow, and less of a comfort in rankings, and maybe the consumer would be it would be to the consumer's detriment to have the LIV sort of poaching some of PGA's best stars. I'm not sure how that necessarily will play out, especially because there is so much money behind the LIV. It's not like the argument could be made, well, let's just see how the market plays out. To some extent, that works better when you evaluate the PGA's position. But when the LIV is so incredibly financed, probably with government money, there's no real market fluctuation depending on whether the consumer is or isn't benefiting.
So as we go down this path towards a lawsuit, and when it does hit, do you anticipate that the timing of it is going to come from when Jay Monahan basically now comes down and how he's going to handle Dustin Johnson, Taylor Gooch, these members that have went against the denial of the release, right? So basically, there's going to be him coming down and saying, here is the punishment. And at that point, that's when the rubber meets the road. Do you believe that's what's going to happen here as far as lawsuits starting?
Yeah, that's exactly right, Travis. I think what will happen is Monahan will impose a suspension, and Dustin Johnson, probably because he's the best the best image from a PR standpoint to take on this fight will move to enjoin the PGA from enforcing that suspension.
And the lawsuit would then be between the player and the PGA Tour, right?
Right. I mean, it's possible the LIV could join in the litigation. Again, from a public perspective, I think that Dustin Johnson is a better name on the caption than the Saudi Arabian controlled tour. But on the other hand, President Biden seems to be becoming more flexible with his view of Saudi Arabia now too. So maybe I'm misjudging how Saudi Arabia is being perceived. I don't think so. I hope not, but I guess that's possible.
And I think where the line is really blurry is when he does govern and when he does come down with the punishment is what is going to be too severe, right? Because he's going to have to make it severe. Like he can't back off. He's made some threats that there could be a potential lifetime ban. I mean, obviously that would be the ultimate punishment and it wouldn't take long to go to a lawsuit from there. But how swiftly and how severe does he come down? And because it's going to have to be, because if it's minor, then more players are going to go.
I think that's exactly right. I can't imagine him imposing a lifetime ban. But
no, I don't think he will.
He has to do something significant enough.
Mm-hmm.
And whether that means a 1-year suspension or pulling the player's card and making him reapply, I don't know.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I guess that's a possibility as well. But it's going to be fascinating to see.
Yeah, it is. It's fascinating.
I'm looking forward to it.
I'm sure. Yeah. I would love to just be a fly on the wall and just listen to you talk about this as all of these things start to transpire, which they're going to happen here. I mean, the wheels are moving now. And there's going to be players. Well, what is it? 40. I think there's 42 players. I think you're going to be playing in London next week. And then they come to the United States in July. And so, and then you factor in, like we talked about, these other 4 governing bodies. And then where do they come in on this? And what does that mean? So there's just so many moving parts. And, I could ask you a million more questions, but, just kind of looking ahead. I mean, what, final question here for you is what are you most interested to see as you look at this between the PGA Tour, these players that are now starting to venture over, the LIV group? What is it that the next move or two are you really intrigued by one or all of these groups that's going to transpire over the next, say, month?
Well, this may be because of my own experiences, but I am looking forward to watching the PGA and seeing whether it has the dexterity to do anything other than take some sort of draconian step, and whether Monahan has the sort of flexibility to figure out something that is sufficiently innovative to put him in the best light as far as public opinion is concerned. So I think that's just from a golf standpoint. I think that watching how the PGA tries to handle this is going to be a very interesting focus.
Peter, can't thank you enough for coming on the Stripe Show podcast. Have a wonderful week, and thank you for joining us.
Thank you very much for your time.